Long before sharks ruled the ocean, something else was already at the top of the food chain. 375 million years ago, the seas covering what is now Ohio and Kentucky were warm, shallow, and filled with creatures that no longer have living equivalents. And somewhere in those waters moved a predator unlike anything alive today. It had no teeth, not broken teeth, not worn down teeth. It never evolved them at all. Instead, its jaws ended in sharpened blades of bone that grew directly from the skull and honed themselves every time the animal bit into prey. The front half of its body was wrapped in interlocking armor plates up to 5 centimeters thick. Sharks already existed in this ocean. They were not at the top. Fossil evidence suggests they were being eaten by this thing instead. And more than 150 years after its fossils were first discovered along the cliffs of Lake Erie, scientists are still arguing about what it actually looked like. A study published in 2025 overturned nearly 2 decades of accepted science about how it hunted, suggesting the ocean's first true superpredator may have been even stranger than anyone realized. Then, after dominating the seas for millions of years, it vanished completely. No descendants, no second lineage, nothing. Today, we descend into ancient seas to meet predators that ruled the ocean before sharks inherited it. Long before the familiar shape of the modern world emerged from the sea, the surface of the earth carried a geography almost impossible to recognize. The continents drifted through warmer latitudes beneath a heavier atmosphere, and much of what would one day become North America rested near the equator, tilted into a belt of shallow tropical water where sunlight reached deep into the seabed. Across the interior of that ancient landmass, an inland sea spread outward for thousands of miles, covering regions that would eventually become Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and the plains beyond them. The stone beneath modern cities had not yet hardened into dry land. It lay soft beneath warm currents, layered in carbonate mud and drifting organic debris beneath a sea unlike any now living. This was the Devonian period, stretching from roughly 419 million to 359 million years ago, a span so immense that entire ecosystems had time to rise, dominate, and vanish within it. Paleontologists would later call it the Age of Fishes, not because fish merely existed there, but because vertebrate life in the ocean underwent one of the most dramatic evolutionary expansions in Earth's history. Before this interval, most fish drifted through the water with simple jawless mouths, filtering particles from the sea or scavenging along the bottom. Their movements were slow, their feeding limited, their ecological roles narrow. Then, over millions of years, jaws appeared and spread through the oceans with astonishing speed. The arrival of biting mouths changed the architecture of life itself. Predation intensified, armor thickened, bodies became faster, heavier, and more specialized. Entire evolutionary experiments unfolded simultaneously in the warm Devonian seas, each lineage competing for new ecological territory in waters crowded with unfamiliar forms. Some developed crushing plates for breaking shellfish apart. Others evolved narrow jaws built for slicing flesh from soft-bodied prey. Fins became more efficient, senses sharpened, and the oceans filled with animals testing biological designs that had never existed before. Above these expanding food webs rose the great reef systems of the Paleozoic world. They stretched across continental shelves in immense structures visible from space if any eye had existed to witness them. Yet these reefs were not built by modern coral communities. The architects were stromatoporoids, strange sponge-like organisms layered in mineral skeletons alongside tabulate corals whose descendants would not survive into the modern age. Together they raised towering carbonate labyrinths filled with chambers, ledges, and narrow passages where marine life multiplied in extraordinary density beneath warm, oxygen-rich currents. Among this abundance appeared the earliest sharks. They were still primitive creatures then, small-bodied and anatomically distant from the forms that dominate the oceans today. Their skeletons remained soft and lightly constructed, their teeth simple, their ecological role modest beside the armored giants sharing the same waters. They moved through the reefs and open channels as agile hunters of smaller prey. But they were not yet rulers of the sea. That position belonged to another lineage entirely, the placoderms, armored-jawed fish encased in dense bony plates, spread through nearly every marine environment on Earth. More than 200 genera emerged during the Devonian, ranging from bottom-feeding scavengers, no larger than a hand, to massive open-water predators built like moving fortresses. Their bodies carried a strange mixture of rigidity and motion, heavy armor fused around flexible joints that allowed them to maneuver with surprising force through the warm inland seas. From one branch of these placoderms, the arthrodeers, something larger eventually emerged from the reefs and dark open water. A predator built not simply to survive in the Devonian Ocean, but to define it. The cliffs along the southern shore of Lake Erie do not appear ancient at first glance. In summer, the shale darkens beneath rain and lake wind, layered in long brittle shelves, where grass leans over the edge and gulls drift inland above the water. The stone breaks easily there. Thin fragments loosen from the cliff face and tumble down toward the shoreline, exposing narrow bands of black rock that once rested beneath a tropical sea so old that even the earliest forests on Earth were still young when its sediments settled into mud. In July of 1867, a hotel owner named J. Terrell walked those cliffs near Sheffield Lake, Ohio, searching for fossils among the shale. He was not a formally trained paleontologist. Like many fossil collectors of the 19th century, he worked through patience and familiarity, learning the texture of certain rocks, the shape of broken shells, the faint geometry that separated ordinary stone from the remains of something once alive. Along the lake shore, he noticed a cluster of massive bony plates emerging from the cliff wall, dark and tightly fitted together in a pattern unlike anything known from the scientific literature of the time. What Terrell uncovered was not a complete animal. It was only the front portion of a skull, though even that fragment carried an unusual weight and scale. The plates interlocked like armor forged from stone itself, layered across what had clearly been the head and shoulders of an enormous predator. There were no familiar teeth, no delicate rib bones, no graceful outline preserving the shape of the full body, only a dense arrangement of fossilized bone compressed within the shale after hundreds of millions of years beneath the earth. The fossil eventually reached scientists studying the Devonian rocks of the American Midwest, where it joined other armored remains emerging from the Cleveland Shale formation. Yet the animal resisted easy classification. Decades passed while paleontologists compared fragments, revised identifications, and argued over anatomy reconstructed from incomplete evidence. It would take nearly 90 years before the species received a formal scientific name. In 1956, the armored predator was named Dunkleosteus terrelli, honoring both Terrell and David Dunkel, curator of vertebrate paleontology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, whose work helped organize and preserve the growing fossil record of the animal. The Cleveland Shale itself became as important to the story as the creature preserved within it. During the late Devonian, this region formed part of a shallow subtropical sea spreading across what is now Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. Fine sediment drifted downward into deeper oxygen-poor water where decomposition slowed almost to stillness. Organisms sinking into those quiet layers were gradually sealed beneath dark accumulating mud. Over immense stretches of time, the seabed hardened into shale, preserving traces of vanished ecosystems with unusual clarity. For Dunkleosteus, this environment created both revelation and uncertainty. The armored skull and thoracic plates fossilized beautifully because they were composed of dense bone. The remainder of the body, built largely from cartilage like the skeleton of a modern shark, dissolved long before fossilization could preserve it. What survived was only the heavy front architecture of the animal, separated forever from the softer structures trailing behind it through the water. That absence became one of the longest running debates in vertebrate paleontology. Without a preserved body, every reconstruction remained partly speculative, shaped by comparison, inference, and evolving interpretation. Some imagined a long shark-like hunter cutting through open water. Others envisioned a shorter, deeper-bodied predator carrying immense weight beneath its armored head. As more fossils emerged from Morocco, Belgium, Poland, and other Devonian deposits across Europe, it became clear that Dunkleosteus was not a local curiosity confined to one inland sea. It belonged to a widespread lineage moving through ancient oceans across much of the planet. At least 8 to 10 recognized species now occupy the genus, varying in size and geography, scattered through the fossil record, like fragments of a world whose full shape still refuses to settle completely into view. Museum mounts have carried many different versions of Dunkleosteus across the last century. Some stretch long and narrow through the gallery air, like oversized sharks armored only at the front. Others swell outward into thick muscular shapes with shortened bodies and immense shoulders. The skull remains mostly unchanged between them, the same heavy arrangement of bone plates fitted together with mechanical precision, but everything behind the head shifts depending on who is reconstructing the animal and what assumptions guide the missing anatomy. The uncertainty exists because the greater part of the creature never fossilized. Only the armored head and thoracic region persist consistently in the rock record, preserved in dense mineral bone, while the softer rear body disappeared into deep time. Like modern sharks, Dunkleosteus carried much of its internal structure in cartilage rather than heavily ossified skeleton. Cartilage decays quickly after death and rarely survives the fossilization process unless conditions are unusually exceptional. In the Devonian Shale, the armored front half endured, while the tail, fins, and much of the body dissolved away long before stone could preserve their outlines. For much of the 20th century, paleontologists estimated Dunkleosteus at lengths between 5 and 10 meters, with some reconstructions extending even farther. The animal was often portrayed at nearly 30 feet long, occupying roughly the same size category as a large modern great white shark. These estimates emerged from comparison rather than direct evidence. Because the rear anatomy remained unknown, researchers assumed the body proportions resembled those of fast open water sharks, elongated and streamlined behind the massive skull. The result became deeply familiar in books, documentaries, and museum exhibits, a giant armored shark analog moving through the Devonian Sea. Yet the fossils themselves carried a different possibility quietly inside them. In 2023, paleontologist Russell Engelman of Case Western Reserve University revisited the problem using a broader anatomical comparison across hundreds of living fish species. Instead of estimating total body size from general resemblance, he focused on a specific measurement called orbit opercula length, the distance between the eye socket and the rear edge of the gill plate. Across modern fish, this proportion correlates remarkably well with overall body length. even among species with dramatically different lifestyles and shapes. When Engelmann applied this analysis to Dunkleosteus torelli, the results narrowed substantially. Rather than a monster approaching 10 meters, the animal likely measured closer to 3.3 to 4.1 meters in length, roughly 11 to 13 feet. The reduction surprised many paleontologists because it contradicted generations of visual reconstruction. Yet the smaller estimate did not diminish the predator itself. If anything, the new interpretation made the anatomy more unusual. Engelmann's calculations suggested that an 11-foot Dunkleosteus possessed roughly the same mass as a 15-foot great white shark. The body was not slender, it was dense, compact, and heavily muscled, carrying extraordinary weight through a shorter frame. Instead of the sleek proportions associated with pelagic sharks, the reconstruction resembled something closer to a giant tuna or billfish, thick through the torso and built for sudden acceleration rather than endless cruising. The armored plates at the front added still more bulk, transforming the animal into a moving concentration of bone and muscle, unlike any modern marine predator. Engelmann described the creatures as being built like wrecking balls, and the phrase lingers because it captures the strange physical logic emerging from the fossils. Nearly every aspect of the anatomy appears concentrated toward force production. The head dominates the body. The jaws occupy an enormous proportion of the total frame. Relative to body size, the mouth may have been nearly twice as large as that of a great white shark. Rather than a balanced fish with armor attached to it, Dunkleosteus begins to resemble a heavily reinforced engine designed around feeding mechanics first, with the rest of the animal existing mainly to propel that enormous armored mouth through the water. The result is stranger than the older reconstructions ever suggested. Not a giant shark in armor, but a compact predator carrying immense density beneath a skull built to overwhelm whatever entered its reach. The front edge of the Dunkleosteus skull ends in something that does not exist anywhere in the modern ocean. There are no rows of replaceable teeth, no serrated enamel structures growing from soft tissue gums, no hidden reserve waiting beneath the jaw to rotate forward when older teeth break away. The cutting surfaces are part of the skull itself, extensions of living bone shaped into sharpened blades that form directly from the jaw plates. The predator carried its weapons fused permanently into its own anatomy. As the jaws closed, the upper and lower blades slid past one another in a precise motion that continually sharpened their edges. Each bite honed the next. Bone ground against bone in slow repetition across years of feeding, maintaining a cutting surface that did not dull in the ordinary way teeth do. There was no replacement cycle because nothing needed replacing. The blades grew continuously through the animal's life, preserving a sharpened edge through use rather than despite it. In biological terms, the system resembled a self-maintaining cutting instrument, less like the mouth of a fish than a pair of moving shears embedded into the face of a living predator. Near the front of the jaws, two protruding structures curved slightly forward, like short tusks. They appear to have functioned as initial contact points during attack, piercing or gripping prey before the heavier rear blades closed through flesh and bone behind them. The arrangement created a sequence of motion rather than a single crushing bite. First contact, then restraint, then slicing force delivered deeper within the jaws as the mouth closed fully. For many years, paleontologists attempted to measure the force produced by this anatomy through biomechanical reconstruction. In 2007, a study published in Biology Letters modeled the jaw system and estimated bite forces exceeding 4,400 newtons near the jaw tip and more than 5,300 newtons farther back along the blade plates. Those figures placed Dunkleosteus among the most powerful known aquatic predators of its size, comparable in raw force to large crocodilians living today. The calculations suggested a predator capable of rapid jaw acceleration and extraordinary pressure concentrated through relatively narrow cutting edges. Yet the anatomy remained incomplete, and with incomplete anatomy came hidden assumptions. The earlier models interpreted Dunkleosteus as a form of suction feeder, an animal opening its mouth suddenly to generate negative pressure that pulled prey inward before the jaws snapped shut. The theory fits some aspects of the cranial mechanics known at the time, particularly the wide gape and fast opening motion suggested by the hinged skull. Then, in 2025, Russell Engelman and colleagues published a new study in the Anatomical Record that revised much of the picture. Their work examined the jaw structures in greater detail and found several features incompatible with suction feeding. The mouth opening was too large to form an effective pressure seal. The joints of the skull were more rigid than previously assumed. The fang-like projections at the front of the jaws appeared built for direct physical impact rather than vacuum-based prey capture. Most importantly, the skull lacked the soft tissue sealing structures necessary to generate the kind of focused suction used by many modern fish. The implications spread outward through nearly every previous reconstruction. If Dunkleosteus was not a suction feeder, then many of the muscle arrangements used in earlier bite force calculations were likely incorrect. Engelman's study also revealed substantially more cartilage within the skull than earlier paleontologists had recognized, meaning major jaw muscles attached partly through soft tissue rather than directly onto preserved bone. Structures once interpreted as rigid anchor points became less certain beneath the new anatomy. What emerged instead was the image of an active pursuit predator. The body now appeared built for forward momentum, carrying dense armor and immense jaws into prey through direct physical collision. Rather than waiting motionless in the water or drawing animals inward through suction, Dunkleosteus likely chased targets down and struck with a charging bite, gripping prey with the forward tusks, while the rear blades cut through tissue in powerful shearing motions. The jaws were not delicate trapping instruments. They were impact tools, sharpened continuously by the act of feeding itself, moving through the Devonian Sea with a mechanical precision that still feels strangely unfamiliar even now. Most vertebrate skulls operate like boxes. The lower jaw drops downward, the upper skull remains largely fixed, and the mouth opens within the limits imposed by that structure. Even among highly specialized predators, the head usually behaves as a stable frame supporting the mechanics beneath it. Dunkleosteus followed a different design entirely. Its skull was not fixed in place. It moved. Between the armored head and the thoracic shield behind it sat a true cranial joint, a movable connection unlike anything arranged in quite the same way among living vertebrates. As the lower jaw opened, the upper portion of the skull rotated upward at the same time, lifting the front of the head back through a synchronized motion that widened the mouth far beyond what the jaw alone could achieve. The entire front assembly unfolded together, turning the act of feeding into a coordinated mechanical expansion of bone, cartilage, and muscle. This arrangement is known as cranial kinesis, a feature shared among arthrodire placoderms but expressed in Dunkleosteus at an extraordinary scale. The movement was not loose or serpentine like the flexible skull elements found in some modern fish. It was controlled through carefully fitted joints built directly into the armor itself. The plates covering the head and shoulders articulated against one another at precise locations, maintaining structural integrity while still permitting motion. Rather than behaving like a rigid shell, the armor functioned more like a system of interlocking segments engineered around controlled mobility. The preserved fossils reveal how carefully those segments aligned, grooves, ridges, and overlapping contact points suggest a skull built to withstand repeated stress without losing stability. Some of the dermal plates reach thicknesses of nearly 5 centimeters, forming dense layers of bone capable of absorbing substantial impact forces during feeding or collision. Yet despite that mass, the joints remained mobile enough to allow the upper skull to rise during attack. The engineering balance is unusual even by vertebrate standards, combining flexibility and reinforcement within the same structure without sacrificing either completely. Seen from the side, the anatomy begins to resemble less a fish and more a moving siege mechanism adapted to water. The mouth did not simply open. It expanded forward through the coordinated lifting of the skull roof, while the lower jaw dropped beneath it. The resulting gape was immense relative to body size, large enough to engulf prey in a rapid forward strike, while the blade-lined jaws closed inward from above and below. Behind this heavily armored front section, however, the body changed character abruptly. The rear half carried no comparable plating. Instead, it appears to have remained largely cartilaginous and flexible, built for propulsion rather than defense. Fins likely extended from the softer posterior body in arrangements similar in function to those of modern sharks, stabilizing movement while the tail generated thrust through the water. The contrast between the front and rear anatomy is striking. One half resembles an articulated fortress of bone. The other behaves more like a streamlined open-water swimmer designed for acceleration. That division may explain much about how Dunkleosteus moved and hunted. The massive armored head carried enormous weight and mechanical complexity, but the flexible rear body compensated through speed and maneuverability. Rather than evolving toward elegance or hydrodynamic simplicity, the animal appears to have concentrated force into the forward half of the body while leaving propulsion to lighter structures behind it. The result was not graceful in the modern sense. It was functional through imbalance, a predator whose anatomy revolved around delivering momentum into the jaws at the front of the skull. No living vertebrate combines these elements in the same configuration. Hinged cranial armor, continuously sharpening jaw blades, segmented bone plating, and a cartilaginous rear body do not coexist anywhere in the modern ocean. Even among extinct animals, the design remains isolated. Dunkleosteus belongs to a body plan that appeared during the Devonian, dominated the seas for millions of years, and vanished without leaving a direct anatomical descendant behind. What survives now are the stone remains of a biological architecture that the Earth constructed only once. Some of the most revealing fossils associated with Dunkleosteus are not skeletons at all. They are dense, compacted masses preserved near the remains of the animal itself, dark clusters of fragmented bone and partially digested hard tissue compressed within Devonian shale. Paleontologists refer to them as boluses, material swallowed during feeding and later expelled after digestion, stripped away everything softer and more chemically vulnerable. In the ancient seafloor sediments, these rejected fragments hardened into stone alongside the predator that produced them. The behavior has echoes in modern ecosystems. Owls regurgitate pellets of bone and fur after feeding. Some large fish expel indigestible skeletal material in similar ways. Dunkleosteus appears to have followed a comparable pattern, consuming prey whole or in massive sections before later ejecting the hardest remains that its internal chemistry could not fully dissolve. Within those boluses, paleontologists discovered fragments belonging to several kinds of Devonian animals, each one preserving small traces of a vanished food web. Among the remains were teeth from Oridus, a fast-moving cartilaginous fish adapted for open water swimming. The discovery altered assumptions about the predator's behavior. Orodus was not a slow, bottom-dwelling animal vulnerable to passive ambush. It occupied pelagic environments where speed and maneuverability determined survival. Its presence within Dunkleosteus feeding remains suggested an active hunter capable of pursuing agile prey through open water rather than lying motionless along the seabed, waiting for opportunity to drift near. Other fossil associations expanded the picture further. Early sharks, such as Cladoslash and Stethocanthus, appear linked to Dunkleosteus feeding activity alongside smaller placoderms, shelled ammonoids, and large armored fish inhabiting the same marine ecosystems. Some prey likely disappeared into the jaws in single strikes. Others may have required repeated attacks, especially heavily armored animals carrying their own protective plating across the head and thorax. One of the more striking associations involves Titanichthys, a close placoderm relative that reached comparable size while following an entirely different ecological strategy. Unlike Dunkleosteus, Titanichthys appears to have fed primarily through filter feeding, straining plankton and suspended organisms from the water column in a manner somewhat analogous to modern whale sharks. Fossil material attributed to Titanichthys sometimes carries puncture marks matching the dimensions and spacing of Dunkleosteus jaw structures. The evidence suggests that even very large placoderms were not exempt from predation if circumstances allowed it. Taken together, the prey assemblage points toward a hyper-carnivorous lifestyle. More than 70% of the animal's intake likely consisted of flesh, with little or no plant material contributing meaningfully to its diet. Nearly every aspect of the anatomy supports this interpretation. The immense gape, reinforced jaws, sharpened blade plates, and compact muscular body all converge around the demands of consuming large active prey in a crowded marine ecosystem. The revised anatomical work, published in 2025, refined the hunting scenario further. Rather than feeding through suction, Dunkleosteus now appears to have relied on direct high-speed impact. The body accelerated forward through the water, while the fang-like protrusions at the front of the jaws struck first, piercing or gripping prey during initial contact. Once restrained, the rear blade plates closed inward through powerful shearing motions capable of cutting apart tissue, cartilage, and armor alike. The attack sequence resembles neither modern sharks nor crocodilians precisely. It belongs to its own mechanical category, built around collision, leverage, and slicing force delivered through momentum. Even the young appear to have hunted differently from the adults. Fossils attributed to juvenile Dunkleosteus preserve jaw plates with noticeably different shapes and proportions than those of mature individuals. The distinctions imply a gradual dietary transition through growth. Younger animals may have targeted softer or smaller prey that required less cutting force, while fully mature adults shifted toward larger armored species, occupying higher positions in the ecosystem. As the jaw plates thickened and sharpened over time, the feeding strategy itself evolved alongside the body. What emerges from the fossil evidence is not the image of a slow, armored scavenger drifting through ancient water, but a predator in constant motion, built to close distance rapidly and reduce struggling prey into manageable pieces through repeated cutting strikes. The Devonian Sea supported many strange anatomies, but few combined force, speed, and mechanical specialization with the same concentrated intensity carried inside the jaws of Dunkleosteus. In the Devonian Sea, adulthood may have brought a strange kind of isolation. Once a Dunkleosteus reached full size, very little in the water around it possessed the combination of strength, speed, and anatomical force necessary to threaten it directly. The reefs held armored fish, swift cartilaginous hunters, shelled cephalopods, and countless smaller vertebrates moving through the warm currents, yet none carried jaws capable of breaking through the dense cranial plates of a mature arthrodire predator. The armor itself formed a boundary few animals could cross, but the fossil record preserves signs that the boundary was crossed anyway. Some Dunkleosteus armor plates carry deep gouges, punctures, and scraping damage, unlike ordinary post-mortem breakage. The marks penetrate regions of bone thick enough to resist enormous force, cutting through surfaces that had once protected the skull and thorax during life. In 2016, researchers Hall, Ryan, and Scott examined several of these injuries in detail and compared them to the dimensions of known Dunkleosteus jaw structures. The spacing, depth, and curvature aligned closely with the fang-like projections and blade arrangement of another individual from the same genus. No other predator known from that ecosystem appears capable of producing the same pattern. The Devonian Ocean contained many hunters, but very few anatomical tools able to puncture nearly 5 centimeters of dermal bone. The simplest explanation emerging from the fossils was also the most direct. Dunkleosteus was attacking other Dunkleosteus. The evidence points not toward occasional scavenging, but toward active cannibalism, likely involving larger adults preying upon smaller or younger members of their own species. In a food web already dominated by hypercarnivorous predators, the apex position narrowed the list of viable prey. A large, mature arthrodire, moving through offshore waters, encountered fewer animals capable of sustaining its metabolic demands. Under those conditions, smaller members of its own lineage may have become part of the ecological equation. The fossil distribution itself seems to preserve traces of this pressure. Juvenile Dunkleosteus remains appear disproportionately concentrated in shallower depositional environments, while larger adult specimens dominate deeper offshore sediments. The pattern resembles a form of habitat separation, with younger animals remaining closer to protected coastal waters, while mature adults occupied open marine territory farther from shore. Similar nursery behavior exists among some modern sharks, where juveniles remain in shallow regions less frequented by large predators. In the Devonian, however, the predator being avoided was not another species, it was their own future form. This transforms the ecology of Dunkleosteus into something unusually self-contained. Most apex predators exist within systems where some external threat still applies pressure, whether through competition, disease, environmental instability, or predation during vulnerable life stages. For Dunkleosteus adults, external predation pressure appears to have approached almost nothing. The only organism regularly equipped to overcome the armor, seize control of the jaws, and deliver lethal force was another mature individual carrying the same anatomy. Cannibalism under those circumstances may have acted as a form of biological regulation. The largest individuals effectively controlled population density through direct predation on smaller conspecifics, limiting the number of competitors capable of reaching maturity within a finite ecosystem. In modern ecological theory, carrying capacity describes the maximum population an environment can sustain before resources become limiting. In the Devonian Sea, Dunkleosteus may have enforced that limit physically, through selective pressure delivered by its own species, rather than by scarcity alone. The implications reach beyond feeding behavior. A juvenile moving through shallow water carried not only the challenge of finding food and avoiding external predators, but also the necessity of avoiding mature adults from the same lineage. Growth itself altered the ecological role of the animal. As the jaws thickened and the armor expanded with age, each individual gradually crossed an invisible boundary from vulnerable prey into dominant predator. The ocean held many dangers during the Devonian, yet for Dunkleosteus the most persistent danger may have come from within its own lineage, carried in the same hinged skull, the same sharpened jaw blades, and the same armored anatomy that allowed the species to dominate the sea for millions of years. Currents moved differently through the Devonian world. They crossed continents that no longer exist in their ancient arrangement, spreading through warm inland seas beneath skies untouched by polar ice. The North Pole rested in open ocean then, and sea surface temperatures remained far higher than those familiar to the modern Earth. Across equatorial latitudes, shallow water flooded continental interiors in vast luminous shelves where sunlight penetrated deeply into the marine landscape. What is now the central United States lay submerged beneath a broad tropical sea, stretching from the region that would one day become the Gulf of Mexico northward toward the future Canadian Arctic. Within those waters, life multiplied on a scale the planet had not previously sustained. The late Devonian Ocean became one of the most productive marine systems yet assembled in Earth's history, dense with suspended nutrients, reef ecosystems, shelled invertebrates, armored vertebrates, and fast-moving predators occupying every layer of the water column. The seafloor itself formed a living structure. Great reef complexes spread outward across the continental shelves, rising through the shallow water in enormous carbonate frameworks, visible across immense distances beneath the surface. These reefs were not built by the corals familiar today. Their architects belonged to lineages now entirely extinct. Stromatoporoids, sponge-like organisms layered in mineralized skeletons, fused together with tabulate corals whose rigid colonial structures formed branching walls and chambers throughout the reef. Over millions of years, they raised sprawling biological cities beneath the sea, dense labyrinths of stone and living tissue where marine species crowded into every available niche. Brachiopods clustered across ledges and sediment plains in immense numbers, their shells superficially resembling clams, though belonging to an entirely different evolutionary branch. Trilobites still crawled across the sea floor, diminished from their earlier Cambrian dominance, but nonetheless abundant within the Devonian ecosystem. Early ammonoids drifted through open water, carrying tightly coiled shells, adjusting buoyancy through internal chambers while moving among reef passages and pelagic currents. Around them swam dozens upon dozens of fish lineages, each experimenting with body plans that would later vanish, transform, or give rise to future vertebrate groups. The water itself remained warm and chemically stable across much of the period. Without permanent polar ice caps locking away global moisture, sea levels stayed high, drowning continental margins beneath broad, shallow seas, rich in dissolved minerals and biological productivity. Sunlight filtered downward through long columns of water onto reefs crowded with armored fish, shelled grazers, and swift predatory forms weaving between the structures. Among the more recognizable inhabitants was Cladoceles, one of the earliest sharks, whose anatomy still feels faintly familiar to modern eyes. It carried a streamlined body roughly 2 meters in length, powered by a forked tail adapted for agile swimming in open water. Yet even Cladoceles remained primitive compared to sharks alive today. Its vertebrae lacked the heavy calcification seen in modern species, and its teeth remained relatively simple. Without the highly specialized serrations and replacement systems later shark lineages would evolve. In the Devonian Sea, sharks existed, but they did not dominate. They occupied only part of a much larger vertebrate experiment unfolding beneath the surface. The true rulers of the ecosystem were the placoderms, armored, jawed fish spread across more than 200 known genera and nearly every marine habitat on Earth. Some grazed quietly along the bottom sediments. Others hovered near reefs, crushing hard-shelled prey with reinforced jaws. Some remained small enough to vanish among dense reef structures, while others grew into massive pelagic predators carrying thick cranial armor through the open sea. Their diversity shaped the structure of the entire ecosystem. Placoderms occupied the ecological roles that sharks, bony fish, and marine reptiles would later inherit in other eras. The Devonian Ocean was organized around them, from shallow coastal nurseries to offshore hunting grounds. And above all of it moved the arthrodires, the heavily armored lineage that produced the dominant apex predator of the age, carrying blade jaws and articulated skulls through one of the richest marine worlds the Earth had yet assembled. For tens of millions of years, placoderms occupied nearly every corner of the marine world, yet their name rarely appears beside the more familiar giants of prehistoric life. Dinosaurs dominate museums, mammoths fill documentaries, and sharks carry an uninterrupted presence into the modern ocean. But the armored fish that once ruled the Devonian remain strangely quiet in cultural memory. Their disappearance was so complete that nothing visibly recognizable survived to carry their form forward. No living descendant still wears their armor or moves with their articulated skulls through the sea. The lineage ended entirely, leaving only fossils pressed into ancient rock and scattered clues to a dynasty that once controlled the oceans. Before placoderms emerged, vertebrate life moved through a very different biological landscape. Most early fish lacked true jaws altogether. They fed by filtering suspended particles from the water or sifting through sediment along the sea floor with soft, circular mouths incapable of grasping, slicing, or crushing prey. Their interactions with the environment remained limited by that anatomy. Without jaws, feeding strategies stayed relatively passive, and the range of ecological roles available to vertebrates remained narrow. Then, gradually, the structure that would transform vertebrate evolution appeared. The jaw altered the relationship between animal and environment more profoundly than almost any other anatomical innovation in Earth's history. It allowed prey to be seized directly rather than merely filtered from water. It permitted defense through biting force and changed how food could be processed inside the body. Over immense evolutionary spans, the same structural principles underlying those early jaws would eventually contribute to speech, facial expression, and the fine muscular control required for human language and tool use. Placoderms stand near the beginning of that transformation. They were among the first vertebrates to carry fully functional jaws, and once the adaptation appeared, it diversified with remarkable speed. Some placoderms evolved reinforced crushing plates capable of breaking hard-shelled prey apart along the seafloor. Others developed sharpened cutting surfaces suited for predation. Some specialized in open water hunting, while others remained close to reefs and sediment plains. Certain species filtered plankton from the water column with broad, gentle mouths, despite sharing ancestry with heavily armored predators. Titanichthys offers one of the strangest examples of this diversity. It belonged to the same broad arthrodire lineage that produced Dunkleosteus and reached roughly comparable dimensions, yet its lifestyle appears to have been almost entirely different. Rather than hunting large prey, Titanichthys likely moved slowly through Devonian waters, filtering microscopic organisms from the sea in vast quantities. occupying an ecological role similar in principle to modern whale sharks or basking sharks. Two enormous armored fish shared the same ocean while feeding at opposite ends of the food web, one relying on plankton drifting invisibly through warm currents, the other pursuing active vertebrate prey through the open sea. The placoderms also carried another evolutionary innovation whose significance would only become fully clear hundreds of millions of years later. Evidence from exceptionally preserved fossils suggests they were among the earliest vertebrates to reproduce through internal fertilization. In the Gogo Formation of Western Australia, limestone deposits preserved placoderm anatomy in extraordinary detail, including soft tissue structures almost never retained in rocks of such age. In 2008, a study published in Nature described a fossil placoderm containing a preserved embryo inside the adult body cavity, still connected by what appeared to be a mineralized umbilical cord. The specimen, dating to roughly 380 million years ago, represented the oldest known example of live birth in the vertebrate fossil record. The discovery eventually entered the Guinness World Records because it pushed complex vertebrate reproduction far deeper into Earth's history than previously understood. The implication changes how these animals are imagined. Placoderms were not primitive failures fumbling through evolutionary experimentation. They were innovators establishing anatomical systems that would become foundational to vertebrate life itself. Jaws, reproductive strategies, ecological specialization, and advanced predatory mechanics all expanded dramatically under their dominance. For 70 million years, the oceans belonged to them, and much of what later vertebrates inherited first took shape beneath the armor of these forgotten fish. In the remote Kimberley region of Western Australia, ancient reef limestone lies scattered across dry ground beneath open sky, far from the warm Devonian sea in which it first formed. The rocks appear unremarkable at a distance, pale, weathered nodules emerging from red earth and sparse vegetation, yet inside some of them rests an extraordinary kind of preservation. The Gogo Formation captures details that almost never survive across such immense spans of geological time. Soft tissues, muscle traces, nerve structures, and delicate internal anatomy remain suspended within stone in three-dimensional form, protected from collapse by mineralization that unfolded slowly inside sealed limestone chambers beneath the sea floor. For paleontologists studying Devonian vertebrates, the site became something close to a biological archive. Fossils emerging from the Gogo nodules preserved not only the armor and external structures familiar from many placoderm specimens, but also the hidden anatomy usually erased long before fossilization can begin. Internal organs, blood vessel pathways, and reproductive structures endured in remarkable detail, transforming the understanding of early jawed vertebrates. In 2005, paleontologist John Long of Museum Victoria led an expedition to the Gogo site that recovered one of the most consequential fossils yet found there. Encased within limestone was the body of a placoderm fish carrying something preserved deep inside the abdominal cavity. Under careful preparation and microscopic examination, researchers realized they were looking not at swallowed prey or random internal debris, but at a developing embryo positioned within the adult body itself. The embryo remained connected to the mother by what appeared to be a mineralized umbilical structure preserved in the final stages before birth. The arrangement resembled reproductive systems associated with live-bearing vertebrates rather than egg-laying fish. The fossil species received the name Matterpiscus attenboroughi, honoring David Attenborough, who had filmed the Gogo fossil beds decades earlier during a documentary expedition in the late 1970s. The implications spread far beyond the anatomy of a single fish. Before the discovery, the earliest known evidence for vertebrate live birth appeared much later in the fossil record. Matterpissus pushed that evidence backward by roughly 180 million years, revealing that complex reproductive systems involving internal fertilization and live developing embryos already existed deep within the Devonian world. At the time of publication, the specimen represented the oldest known example of sexual reproduction and live birth ever identified among vertebrates. Other placoderm fossils from Gogo reinforced the interpretation. Male individuals carried clasping structures attached to their pelvic fins, anatomically comparable in function to the claspers used by modern sharks and rays during mating. These appendages allowed males to maintain physical connection with females during internal fertilization, a reproductive strategy requiring far greater anatomical coordination than simple external spawning into open water. The Devonian Ocean, already crowded with evolutionary experimentation in jaws and locomotion, he had also become a place where vertebrates were refining intimate reproductive systems, still recognizable hundreds of millions of years later. A second discovery deepened the picture further. Another placoderm species from the same formation, Incissoscutum richiae, preserved not one embryo, but 3 developing offspring within the adult body cavity. The fossil became the oldest known vertebrate triplet pregnancy ever identified, preserving a reproductive scene unfolding in the Devonian Sea long before the first reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, or mammals existed on land. These discoveries alter the image of placoderms in subtle ways. Their armor and blade jaws can create the impression of purely mechanical animals, organisms defined entirely by force and predation. Yet inside the same bodies existed reproductive systems of remarkable complexity and intimacy, carrying developing young internally through extended gestation rather than abandoning fertilized eggs to the open sea. Because Dunkleosteus belonged to the arthrodire placoderms, the broader implications reach directly into its biology as well. Although no embryo has been discovered inside a Dunkleosteus specimen itself, the reproductive anatomy preserved across related placoderms strongly suggests the species reproduced through internal fertilization and may well have given birth to live young. The armored apex predator of the Devonian, carrying sharpened bone blades and articulated cranial armor through warm prehistoric seas, likely entered the world not from drifting eggs scattered into the water, but from the body of its mother, already formed and alive within the darkness of the ancient ocean. The armor of Dunkleosteus began as living skin. Beneath the surface of the Devonian Sea, cells within the outer tissue gradually secreted dense layers of dermal bone, building broad, interlocking plates directly inside the skin itself, rather than around an internal skeleton. The same biological process still survives in distant form within turtle shells and the bony osteoderms carried beneath the skin of crocodiles, though in Dunkleosteus, the system expanded into something far more extensive. The head and shoulders became enclosed within a rigid craniothoracic shield, transforming the front half of the animal into a moving structure of articulated bone. The plates were not ornamental coverings added onto an otherwise ordinary fish. They formed the central architecture of the body. Muscles attached directly against the interior surfaces of the armor, using the rigid framework as leverage for movement and feeding mechanics. The hinged skull, the enormous gape, and the force driving the blade-lined jaws all depended partly upon the structural stability provided by those plates. Armor and feeding anatomy evolved together as a single integrated system rather than separate features layered atop one another. In some regions, The dermal bone reached thicknesses approaching 5 centimeters. Such density offered substantial resistance against attack, particularly from the comparatively primitive jaws carried by most Devonian predators. Even among large placoderms, relatively few animals possessed enough force to damage a mature Dunkleosteus shield directly. The armor distributed impact across overlapping surfaces and reinforced joints, reducing the chance that concentrated pressure would fracture the skull during violent feeding collisions or intraspecific combat. Yet the armor was not uniform across the body. Fossil evidence reveals variation in thickness, curvature, and structural reinforcement between different regions of the shield. The snout and anterior surfaces appear strengthened differently from the lateral plates along the sides of the head and thorax, suggesting that specific areas absorbed different forms of mechanical stress. Portions likely experienced repeated impact during prey capture, while others stabilized muscle attachment or protected vulnerable sensory structures. The entire arrangement resembles a biological engineering solution refined over millions of years through selective pressure imposed by collision, feeding force, and survival within an ecosystem crowded with armored vertebrates. That weight shaped the rest of the body around it. Carrying such a dense forward structure required unusual muscular development throughout the torso and tail region. The compact proportions reconstructed in recent anatomical studies begin to make more sense when viewed through the demands imposed by the armor itself. A long, slender body would have struggled to generate enough forward thrust while stabilizing the massive cranial shield at the front. Instead, the anatomy concentrated bulk and power into a shorter, deeper frame capable of accelerating substantial mass through water without losing maneuverability. This may explain why modern comparisons often fail to capture the animal accurately. Sharks distribute flexibility and lightness throughout much of the body, relying on streamlined motion and reduced skeletal density. Dunkleosteus followed a different strategy entirely. The front half behaved almost like a reinforced battering structure driven through the water by a muscular rear body designed to compensate for the extraordinary weight carried ahead of it. Every movement required balancing rigidity with propulsion. The armor also changed across the lifespan of the animal. Juvenile placoderms carried thinner, lighter plates and somewhat different jaw proportions than fully mature adults. As the years passed, the dermal bone thickened and expanded, gradually increasing protection while altering the overall silhouette of the body. Young individuals likely remained faster and more lightly built, while older adults accumulated heavier reinforcement that made them progressively more difficult for other predators to injure. Growth did not merely enlarge the animal, it transformed its physical role within the ecosystem. Behind the shield, however, the body remained almost entirely unarmored. The rear anatomy consisted largely of cartilage and flexible tissue, maintaining the hydrodynamic efficiency necessary for rapid movement through open water. Fins stabilized the body, while the tail generated propulsion, allowing the animal to carry its immense cranial weight without becoming slow or immobile. The contrast between the armored front and flexible rear created a predator assembled from two very different biological principles at once, one built for impact resistance and feeding force, the other for speed, maneuverability, and momentum through the warm Devonian Sea. The silhouette most people imagine when hearing the word shark did not yet exist in the Devonian Sea. There were no great white sharks moving through cold blue water with rows of serrated replacement teeth. No hammerheads sweeping wide sensory arrays through the currents. No sleek pelagic hunters carrying the refined anatomy of the modern ocean. The sharks living alongside Dunkleosteus belong to a far earlier stage of cartilaginous evolution, smaller and stranger creatures, still experimenting with body plans that later lineages would gradually refine over hundreds of millions of years. Their presence in the fossil record can create an illusion of familiarity because the broad outline already existed. They possess tails built for propulsion, streamlined torsos, and flexible skeletons composed largely of cartilage. Yet anatomically, they remained distant from the sharks alive today. Many lacked heavily calcified vertebrae. Their jaws were comparatively simple. Their sensory systems had not yet reached the extraordinary specialization modern sharks would eventually develop through deep evolutionary time. Cladocellae remains the best known example from the late Devonian seas. Fossils preserved within the Cleveland Shale reveal an agile fish, roughly 1 to 2 meters long, with a narrow body and strongly forked tail adapted for fast swimming in open water. It likely hunted actively, pursuing smaller fish and cephalopods through the warm offshore currents. The teeth were simple compared to modern shark dentition, lacking the dense, rotating replacement rows associated with later species. The body carried little heavy reinforcement, relying instead on flexibility and speed. Even its skeleton behaved differently from those of many later sharks. Calcified vertebral structures remained poorly developed, leaving much of the internal support system soft and lightly built. The overall impression is not one of dominance, but of efficiency. A fast-moving predator, occupying a relatively modest ecological role within a much larger vertebrate ecosystem structured around armored placoderms. Another Devonian shark relative, Stethocanthus, carried one of the most unusual anatomies in early cartilaginous evolution. Adult males possessed a bizarre brush-like structure extending across the dorsal fin and upper head region, covered in enlarged denticles, arranged almost like roughened teeth. Paleontologists still debate its function. Some interpretations suggest it may have played a role in mating display or reproductive contact, while others propose hydrodynamic or defensive possibilities. Whatever its precise purpose, the structure illustrates how experimental early shark evolution remained during the Devonian. These were not perfected apex predators moving through mature ecological roles. They were still diversifying into unfamiliar forms. The sensory sophistication associated with modern sharks also remained largely undeveloped. Electroreception systems existed only in more primitive states, lacking the refinement later lineages would use to detect faint muscular activity and electrical signals hidden beneath sediment or darkness. Tooth replacement mechanisms had not yet evolved into the endlessly renewing conveyor systems familiar today. Many Devonian sharks still occupied transitional ecological spaces between earlier jawed fish and the highly specialized predators that would later inherit the oceans. Cladocellae itself appears within the feeding remains associated with Dunkleosteus, preserved among regurgitated boluses and fossil prey assemblages recovered from Devonian deposits. The image is revealing in its simplicity. An agile shark swimming through open water was still vulnerable to a larger armored predator carrying blade-lined jaws and a mechanically reinforced skull. Speed alone did not place sharks at the top of the ecosystem during this period. The Devonian was not the age of sharks. It was an age in which sharks survived as numerous but secondary participants inside a marine world, fundamentally organized around placoderms. Armor-jawed fish occupied the dominant ecological positions from reef dwellers to massive pelagic predators. Sharks remained adaptable, mobile, and evolutionarily promising, but they had not yet seized control of the food web. Their rise required something larger than competition. It required the collapse of the world already in place. Only after the Devonian ecosystems fractured and the placoderm dynasties disappeared would sharks begin expanding into the vacant roles left behind, carrying their lighter skeletons and flexible anatomy into an ocean suddenly emptied of its armored rulers. For millions of years, the Devonian seas had expanded in warmth and complexity, sustaining reef systems so extensive that entire marine communities rose and intertwined around them. The balance appeared durable. Predators moved through crowded food webs, reef builders thickened their mineral frameworks layer by layer, and shallow tropical waters continued supporting one of the richest vertebrate ecosystems the Earth had yet assembled. Then, slowly enough that no single generation of organisms could perceive it, the chemistry of the ocean began to change. The shift did not arrive as a sudden catastrophe. It unfolded in pulses. Oxygen levels in parts of the sea began falling below the thresholds required to support complex marine life, especially within deeper waters and enclosed basins where circulation slowed. Paleontologists and geochemists now refer to this prolonged crisis as the Kellwasser event, named after dark sediment layers in Europe that preserve traces of widespread marine collapse during the late Devonian. Anoxia spread outward through the oceans in repeated waves over roughly 3 million years. In affected regions, oxygen depletion transformed portions of the water column into biological dead zones where large animals struggled to survive. Organic material descending from the surface no longer decomposed efficiently in well-oxygenated environments. Instead, black carbon-rich sediments accumulated along the seafloor beneath waters increasingly hostile to complex ecosystems. The reefs were among the first systems to show visible strain. Stromatoporoid communities that had spent tens of millions of years constructing enormous carbonate frameworks across tropical shelves began declining across broad geographic regions. Entire reef complexes weakened as the organisms responsible for maintaining them died back under worsening chemical conditions. Tabulate corals suffered similar losses. Structures that had once supported dense marine biodiversity slowly fragmented, leaving portions of the shallow seas ecologically diminished. The scale of the reef collapse would echo far beyond the Devonian itself. Coral-dominated reef ecosystems had reached their greatest geographic extent just before the Kellwasser crisis, spreading across equatorial seas in forms unlike any modern coral reef. After the decline began, they would not fully recover comparable ecological complexity until far into the Mesozoic era, more than 100 million years later. The ocean lost not merely species, but entire architectural systems that had organized marine life for immense spans of time. Placoderms suffered heavily within this changing world. Many lineages disappeared entirely as oxygen stress, habitat collapse, and ecological instability spread through the seas. Species adapted to specialized reef environments vanished alongside the structures that sustained them. Others declined as prey networks fragmented and formerly stable marine regions became chemically unstable. The broad placoderm radiation that had once occupied nearly every marine niche began narrowing under environmental pressure. Yet Dunkleosteus and several closely related arthrodires endured through the first stages of the crisis. Large apex predators still moved through the remaining productive waters, hunting within ecosystems that, though damaged, continued functioning in diminished form. Offshore habitats retained enough biological productivity to support substantial vertebrate life, and some reef systems persisted in scattered refuges despite the growing instability surrounding them. The fossil record from this interval preserves an ocean caught between endurance and decline. Predators still hunted. Reef communities still survived in patches. Currents still crossed warm continental seas, carrying plankton, sediment, and marine life through waters that outwardly may have seemed little changed. But beneath the surface, oxygen fluctuations and ecological fragmentation were reshaping the structure of the Devonian world in ways that would become increasingly difficult to reverse. Anoxia differs from many forms of extinction because it attacks the foundation of the environment itself rather than targeting any single group directly. The water remains physically present, yet the chemistry sustaining complex respiration begins slipping away. Mobile animals flee if possible. Sessile reef builders cannot. Food webs thin gradually as oxygen-poor regions expand through interconnected marine basins. The Kellwasser event became the first major warning that the Devonian system was no longer stable. The oceans that had supported armored vertebrate dynasties for tens of millions of years were beginning to lose the conditions that made those dynasties possible at all. Long before forests covered the continents in anything resembling the modern world, the land remained comparatively bare. Thin mats of primitive vegetation clung to damp surfaces near rivers and coastlines, while most continental interiors stretched open beneath wind and rain. During the late Devonian, that emptiness began to change. Plants evolved vascular tissues capable of carrying water upward through tall stems, and with that innovation came the first true trees. Across the continents, rooted forests slowly expanded into landscapes that had never before supported deep-anchored vegetation. Their arrival altered the chemistry of the planet in ways that reached far beyond the land itself. Devonian roots did not merely rest within soil. They penetrated directly into exposed rock, widening cracks and accelerating weathering processes that had previously unfolded much more slowly. Minerals locked inside bedrock began dissolving into groundwater and rivers at unprecedented rates. Among the nutrients released through this erosion was phosphorus, an element capable of transforming marine ecosystems once carried into shallow seas. Rivers draining these newly forested landscapes transported enormous nutrient loads toward the oceans. At first, the changes may have appeared subtle, little more than shifts in water chemistry spreading gradually through estuaries and coastal shelves. Yet across millions of years, the cumulative effect became immense. Shallow Devonian seas received a steady influx of nutrients far beyond what earlier marine systems had evolved to absorb. The response came in the form of explosive algal growth. Blooms spread across warm coastal waters in dense suspended layers, feeding upon the phosphorus and other nutrients pouring from the continents. For a time, the seas may even have appeared biologically abundant at the surface. But when those algae died, their decomposition consumed dissolved oxygen throughout the surrounding water column. Bacteria breaking down the immense organic mass stripped oxygen from the sea faster than circulation could replace it. The process is known as eutrophication, a condition in which nutrient-overloaded waters become oxygen-depleted through biological decay. Modern coastal dead zones still emerge through the same mechanism near heavily fertilized river systems, though the Devonian version unfolded across enormous portions of the planet over spans of geological time. Oxygen levels dropped not because life vanished initially, but because too much organic growth overwhelmed the system sustaining it. At the same time, the forests were reshaping the atmosphere itself. Through photosynthesis, the expanding vegetation drew increasing quantities of carbon dioxide from the air and stored it within wood, roots, and buried organic matter. Atmospheric carbon concentrations gradually declined, the climate cooled. In the southern hemisphere, glaciation began spreading across portions of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana, locking water into growing ice sheets and contributing to falling sea levels. The consequences converged upon the shallow tropical seas where Devonian reef ecosystems had flourished for tens of millions of years. Oxygen declined. Coastal habitats contracted as sea levels dropped. Reef systems fragmented beneath environmental pressures arriving from multiple directions at once. Warm, stable continental shelves that had once supported extraordinary biodiversity became increasingly unstable, chemically altered by processes unfolding on land far beyond the horizon. What makes the late Devonian crisis so striking is the source of the disruption itself. No asteroid impact scar marks the beginning of the extinction. No singular volcanic catastrophe dominates the evidence. Instead, the destabilizing force appears tied partly to one of the great evolutionary successes in Earth's history: the spread of forests across the continents. The same trees transforming the land into richer terrestrial ecosystems were also reshaping atmospheric chemistry, river systems, nutrient cycles, and marine oxygen balance. Roots anchoring themselves into stone on distant floodplains, indirectly altered conditions within tropical seas, thousands of kilometers away. The Earth system had become deeply interconnected, with innovations in one environment capable of destabilizing another. For roughly 60 million years, the Devonian oceans had sustained vast reef complexes, armored vertebrate radiations, and intricate marine food webs beneath warm, oxygen-rich waters. Now those conditions were beginning to unravel. The seas that had once nourished placoderm dynasties were being slowly drained, cooled, and chemically stressed, not through violence descending from the sky, but through forests quietly spreading across the continents above them. The final collapse arrived after the Devonian world had already been weakened for millions of years. Reef systems had shrunk, oxygen instability had spread through shallow seas, and many placoderm lineages had already disappeared into extinction long before the last stage began. Yet portions of the old ecosystem endured. Predators still crossed the remaining continental shelves. Survivors persisted among fragmented reefs and offshore waters. Life continued within an ocean no longer stable, but not yet entirely broken. Then, approximately 359 million years ago, the second crisis unfolded. Paleontologists now call it the Hagenberg event, the terminal extinction pulse marking the end of the Devonian period itself. Together with the earlier Kellwasser decline, it became one of the 5 largest extinction events in the history of animal life on Earth. The collapse spread through marine ecosystems already operating under immense environmental stress. Oxygen depletion intensified again across broad regions of the ocean, while climatic instability and sea level fluctuations disrupted habitats that had survived the earlier phases of decline. The shallow tropical shelves where Devonian biodiversity once flourished became increasingly fragmented and inhospitable. Ecological networks that had persisted through the first crisis finally began failing entirely. The reef systems suffered perhaps the clearest visible destruction. The great stromatoporoid frameworks that had dominated tropical seas for tens of millions of years disappeared almost completely. Reef construction itself nearly ceased. Across vast regions of the world ocean, the biological architecture supporting marine diversity simply stopped growing. For millions of years afterward, during the early Carboniferous, reef ecosystems remained profoundly diminished compared to the extraordinary complexity they once possessed. Many marine groups declined simultaneously. Brachiopods vanished from regions where they had once formed dense seafloor communities. Trilobites, already reduced from their earlier Paleozoic abundance, suffered severe additional losses. Conodonts, ammonoids, jawless fish, and numerous specialized invertebrate lineages declined sharply as marine environments destabilized beyond recovery. The placoderms, however, experienced something even more final. By the time of the Hangenberg event, they had already endured repeated reductions in diversity and geographic range. Entire branches of the lineage had vanished during the preceding environmental crises. The surviving groups represented remnants of what had once been the dominant vertebrate radiation in the ocean. The final extinction removed the rest. Every placoderm lineage disappeared. Every armored-jawed fish that had ruled the Devonian seas for roughly 70 million years vanished before the Carboniferous began. No surviving descendant crossed the boundary into the next geological period. The entire dynasty ended together. Dunkleosteus disappeared within this broader collapse. Fossils belonging to the genus occur only within the final Devonian sediments, never in younger Carboniferous rock layers. The predator that had once occupied the highest position in the marine food web left no surviving continuation. Its extinction did not occur in a singular moment of violence, but through the gradual unraveling of the ecosystem sustaining it. Over hundreds of thousands of years, prey networks fragmented, reef habitats vanished, oxygen instability spread, and the biological foundations supporting large, specialized predators dissolved beneath them. The scale of the disappearance becomes difficult to fully grasp because nothing comparable survives in the modern world. Entire vertebrate dynasties rarely vanish so completely. Placoderms had once occupied nearly every marine niche imaginable, from bottom-feeding specialists to giant filter feeders and heavily armored apex predators. Their anatomical innovations shaped the future evolution of jaws, reproduction, and vertebrate body plans across the planet. Yet after the Hangenberg extinction, no placoderm species remained alive anywhere on Earth. The Devonian Ocean itself did not end instantly. Water still moved across continental shelves. Surviving fish still hunted through the currents. But the world structured around armored vertebrates was gone. The reefs that once sustained extraordinary biodiversity had collapsed into long ecological silence, and the dominant predators that ruled those seas for millions of years disappeared with them into the dark sediment layers, accumulating along the floor of a changing planet. The disappearance of the placoderms leaves behind an unsettling contrast. Sharks survived, early bony fish survived, primitive tetrapods struggling along the margins of rivers and coastal wetlands survived. Yet the armored vertebrates that had dominated the oceans for tens of millions of years vanished completely. The difference was not intelligence or aggression or superiority in hunting ability. For much of the Devonian, placoderms were among the most successful vertebrates on Earth. The explanation appears tied instead to the changing cost of survival itself. In the stable, productive seas of the early and middle Devonian, heavy armor carried enormous advantages. Thick dermal plates protected against predation, reinforced feeding structures, and stabilized powerful musculature. Large placoderms could move through reef systems and open shelf environments, carrying defenses few contemporaries could penetrate. The biological expense of constructing and maintaining that armor remained manageable because the surrounding ecosystem provided abundant oxygen and food. As the oceans destabilized, however, the balance shifted. Oxygen depletion spread through marine habitats already stressed by collapsing reef systems and shrinking coastal shelves. Food webs fragmented. Prey populations fluctuated or disappeared entirely in some regions. Under such conditions, every anatomical structure became part of an energetic equation. The same armor that once guaranteed survival may have begun demanding more resources than the changing environment could reliably provide. Dermal bone is metabolically expensive tissue. Growing and maintaining dense craniothoracic shields required substantial mineral intake, energy allocation, and developmental investment throughout the lifespan of the animal. In oxygen-rich seas, filled with prey, those costs could be sustained. In nutrient-stressed ecosystems where oxygen instability spread across entire marine basins, heavily armored bodies may have become increasingly difficult to support. Large placoderms likely required considerable food intake simply to maintain their massive anatomies. A predator such as Dunkleosteus carried not only thick armor, but also dense musculature, capable of moving that weight through water. As prey networks deteriorated and productive habitats disappeared, maintaining such a body may have become progressively more difficult. Lighter animals with lower energetic requirements possessed advantages that became increasingly important as ecological conditions worsened. Sharks and many early bony fish carried very different skeletal systems. Cartilage weighs less than heavily mineralized dermal armor and requires fewer resources to maintain. Flexible, lightly ossified anatomies also allowed greater variation in movement patterns, habitat use, and feeding strategies. Species able to survive on lower energy budgets could persist longer inside stressed ecosystems where oxygen and prey availability fluctuated unpredictably. Flexibility mattered evolutionarily as well as metabolically. Much of the placoderm body plan depended upon rigid, integrated armor structures linking skull, musculature, and feeding mechanics together. Their anatomy achieved extraordinary specialization, but specialization can narrow the pathways available for rapid adaptation. Modifying the shape or mechanics of such a system required altering multiple interconnected structures simultaneously. Evolutionary change becomes more constrained when major functions are locked into dense, rigid frameworks. Sharks occupied a different position. Their flexible cartilaginous bodies could diversify more freely into changing ecological roles. Variations in jaw shape, swimming behavior, feeding strategy, and habitat preference could evolve without restructuring an entire armored cranial architecture. The very looseness of their anatomy may have granted resilience during periods of environmental instability. Geography also mattered. Placoderms dominated shallow reef systems and productive coastal environments, precisely the habitats most devastated by Devonian anoxia, sea level decline, and reef collapse. Their greatest centers of diversity existed within ecosystems that suffered the heaviest disruption during the Kellwasser and Hangenberg crises. As those shallow marine regions deteriorated, placoderms lost not only prey, but the environmental structures around which their evolutionary success had developed. Some sharks, by contrast, already occupied deeper offshore waters and broader ecological ranges. Open water habitats and deeper marine refuges may have buffered portions of their populations against the worst oxygen instability affecting shallow continental shelves. Survival did not necessarily belong to the strongest predators of the Devonian seas. It belonged to the lineages capable of enduring a world growing increasingly unstable around them. In that sense, the armor did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it had been perfected for an ocean that no longer existed. The beginning of the Carboniferous did not resemble the world that had existed before the extinction. The seas remained physically vast, but biologically diminished. Reef systems that once stretched across tropical shelves in immense living frameworks had collapsed into scattered remnants. Many ecological relationships built over tens of millions of years no longer existed. Entire vertebrate dynasties had disappeared from the oceans, leaving vacant niches where armored predators and specialized placoderm lineages had once dominated. In the aftermath of that collapse, survival itself became opportunity. The lineages that endured the end Devonian extinction encountered oceans suddenly emptied of many former competitors. Ecological space opened across shallow coasts, offshore waters, estuaries, and river systems. Into that altered world, sharks and their relatives expanded with extraordinary speed. The Carboniferous is often described by paleontologists as the golden age of sharks, not because modern sharks had fully appeared, but because cartilaginous fish diversified into an astonishing range of forms after the placoderms vanished. Freed from the ecological pressure imposed by armored vertebrate dominance, shark lineages spread into habitats and feeding roles that had previously been occupied by other groups. Some species moved through freshwater rivers and inland swamps. Others occupied shallow coastal seas or deeper offshore environments. Their body plans diversified rapidly, producing forms so unfamiliar that many would scarcely be recognized as shark relatives by modern observers. Evolutionary experimentation accelerated across the oceans, generating anatomical structures unlike anything alive today. Among the strangest was Helicoprion, a shark relative whose lower jaw carried a tightly coiled spiral of continuously growing teeth. Rather than shedding and replacing teeth in discrete rows, the animal retained older teeth while newer ones emerged behind them, forming a circular saw-like whorl extending inward through the jaw. For more than a century, paleontologists argued over where the structure belonged on the body and how it functioned during feeding. Modern imaging suggests the spiral acted as a slicing mechanism within the lower jaw, pulling soft-bodied prey inward against sharpened cutting surfaces, unlike any feeding anatomy known in living vertebrates. Stethecanthus survived the Devonian extinction as well, carrying its peculiar dorsal brush structure into the Carboniferous seas. Mature males retained the roughened anvil-shaped display across the dorsal region, a structure whose purpose remains uncertain even now. Whether used for mating behavior, display, or another ecological role entirely, the anatomy reflects how unusual shark evolution became during this period of rapid diversification. Another Carboniferous predator, Edestus, evolved jaws carrying long scissor-like tooth blades that projected outward from the mouth rather than being shed away. New teeth continuously formed behind older ones, pushing the cutting edges farther forward through life. The result was a predator whose jaws resembled paired rows of protruding shears, capable of slicing prey with motions very different from those of modern sharks. These animals were not evolutionary failures or transitional oddities struggling toward more advanced forms. They were widespread, successful predators occupying ecosystems across large portions of the ancient world. Cartilaginous fish had inherited the ecological territory left behind by the placoderms, and they were exploring that inheritance in every direction available to them. The oceans themselves remained difficult places after the extinction. Reef systems recovered slowly. Biodiversity remained lower than during the Devonian peak. Yet, sharks possessed advantages increasingly suited to unstable environments. Their lighter skeletons, flexible anatomies, broad habitat tolerance, and adaptable feeding systems allowed them to diversify repeatedly as marine ecosystems rebuilt around them. From this point forward, the dominant apex predators of the oceans would belong primarily to cartilaginous lineages. Over the next hundreds of millions of years, sharks and their relatives would survive every remaining mass extinction in Earth's history, enduring planetary crises that eliminated countless other groups. The placoderms vanished entirely with the Devonian, but the sharks that once occupied secondary ecological roles persisted long enough to inherit the sea. Long before the Devonian seas filled with armored vertebrates, sharks already existed in simpler forms beneath ancient oceans. Their lineage reaches back roughly 450 million years into the Ordovician period, emerging before placoderms rose to dominance and before complex reef ecosystems covered tropical shelves at their greatest extent. At first, they occupied relatively modest ecological roles among a world still experimenting with jawed vertebrate life. Nothing in those early cartilaginous fish suggested that they would become one of the most enduring lineages in the entire history of animals. Yet they remained. They survived the end Ordovician extinction, when dramatic climatic shifts and falling sea levels eliminated enormous portions of marine biodiversity across the planet. They survived the Devonian collapse that erased the placoderms and dismantled reef systems that had structured ocean life for tens of millions of years. They survived the end Permian catastrophe, often called the Great Dying, when roughly 96% of marine species disappeared beneath environmental conditions so severe that entire ecosystems nearly ceased functioning. They endured the end Triassic extinction and later survived the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous that eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs. No other vertebrate lineage possesses this uninterrupted record across all 5 major mass extinctions. Mammals do not, birds do not, reptiles do not. Even many ancient fish groups that once seemed enormously successful eventually vanished, while sharks persisted through one planetary crisis after another. Their survival does not appear linked to any single miraculous adaptation. Instead, it reflects a collection of biological characteristics that together created unusual resilience during unstable periods of Earth history. Cartilaginous skeletons remained lighter and metabolically cheaper than heavily mineralized bone. Flexible bodies allowed broad variation in swimming mechanics and feeding behavior. Many shark lineages tolerated a wide range of prey types and environmental conditions rather than depending upon narrow ecological specialization alone. Equally important was their capacity to occupy multiple marine environments simultaneously. Some species lived in shallow coastal systems. Others moved through deeper offshore waters, less affected by coastal collapse and oxygen instability. Still others entered estuaries, river mouths, or freshwater environments. During extinction events, this geographic and ecological distribution created refuges where portions of the lineage could survive even while entire ecosystems disappeared elsewhere. The sharks that endured the Devonian extinction were not the rulers of that ocean. They survived partly because they occupied positions beneath the placoderms rather than directly competing with them at the top of the food chain. Their populations existed across ecological spaces that remained comparatively peripheral during the height of placoderm dominance. When reef systems collapsed and shallow marine ecosystems fragmented, some of those secondary niches persisted long enough for cartilaginous fish to endure within them. There is a quiet irony in that pattern. The placoderms had become so successful within the Devonian world that their biology increasingly depended upon the stability of the very ecosystems that later collapsed. Sharks retained flexibility precisely because they had not yet consolidated dominance across the oceans. Their survival emerged not from supremacy, but from adaptability and distribution. Over geological time, occupying secondary ecological roles may sometimes provide greater long-term stability than occupying the apex itself. Dominant predators often evolve towards specialization within highly productive environments. They become tightly linked to the ecosystems supporting their success. When those systems fail, specialization can transform into vulnerability. Sharks endured because they remained diffuse, adaptable, and ecologically broad. Some species disappeared during each extinction, but the lineage itself retained enough diversity and environmental reach to recover repeatedly afterward. They did not preserve the Devonian world. They simply outlasted it. Dunkleosteus represented the perfected apex predator of one extraordinary marine age, a creature built with immense precision for a stable, oxygen-rich ocean filled with armored prey and vast reef systems. Sharks represented something else entirely, a lineage capable of surviving instability without requiring the world around it to remain unchanged. Being first carried enormous power for a time. Being second carried survival across 500 million years. Along the southern shore of Lake Erie, dark bands of shale still emerge from the earth in low cliffs and fractured ledges, exposed by wind, winter ice, and the slow abrasion of water against stone. To passing eyes, they appear quiet and ordinary, thin layers of black rock pressed between younger sediments. Yet inside those compressed beds lies one of the clearest surviving records of the final age of the placoderms, a graveyard preserving fragments of a vanished ocean in extraordinary detail. The Cleveland Shale of northern Ohio formed during the late Devonian beneath a shallow inland sea that once covered much of eastern North America. Far below the sunlit surface, the bottom waters of that sea contained almost no dissolved oxygen. Organisms that drifted downward after death settled into stagnant mud where scavengers struggled to survive and decomposing bacteria operated only weakly. Bodies that would normally vanish into fragments instead remained intact long enough to be buried beneath fine sediment. It is one of paleontology's quieter ironies that the same anoxic conditions contributing to ecological collapse also created the chemical stillness necessary for remarkable fossil preservation. The ocean that slowly lost its capacity to sustain complex life became, in death, an archive of that lost complexity. Armor plates, skull roofs, jaw blades, and thoracic shields settled into black mud that hardened over hundreds of millions of years into shale. Those rocks remain exposed today along portions of the Lake Erie shoreline, including the same general region near Sheffield Lake, where J. Terrell discovered the first great skull in the summer of 1867. The cliffs are smaller now than many imagine, weathered and interrupted by vegetation, roads, and modern development. Yet, the geological layers remain visible beneath the surface of the present world, carrying within them the compressed remains of a tropical sea that no longer exists. From these deposits emerged the best preserved Dunkleosteus specimens ever discovered. The armored head and shoulder structures fossilized with striking clarity because they were composed of dense dermal bone, capable of enduring burial and geological compression across immense spans of time. The softer rear body vanished almost completely, leaving only hints of proportions and movement behind the great plated skull. Many of the most important specimens eventually entered the collections of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, where full-scale casts of Dunkleosteus now hang suspended within the museum halls. Visitors often encounter the immense armored skull first, followed by silhouette reconstructions, extending backward into estimated body shapes based upon modern scientific interpretation. Even there, in carefully assembled displays, uncertainty still lingers behind the outlines. The fossils preserve certainty at the front of the animal and silence behind it. For decades, that silence remained largely unquestioned. Although Dunkleosteus terrelli had been formally named during the 1950s, The species itself received surprisingly little comprehensive anatomical reassessment afterward. Recent studies from researchers, including Russell Engelman and colleagues at Case Western Reserve University, described the animal as having been scientifically neglected for nearly a century. Basic assumptions concerning body length, posture, feeding mechanics, and ecological role persisted across generations without detailed reevaluation. Part of that persistence came from the fossils themselves. The preserved armor appears so imposing, so mechanically complete, that earlier reconstructions gained an almost intuitive authority. Once large shark-like body plans entered museums, books, and documentaries, they hardened into expectation. Without preserved tails, fins, or vertebral columns to contradict them, the assumptions remained remarkably stable. Only recently have paleontologists returned to the Cleveland Shale with newer analytical methods, reconsidering measurements, muscle attachment patterns, cartilage distribution, and feeding mechanics with fresh attention. The Black Shale continues offering new information from specimens collected long ago, as though the Devonian seafloor still releases fragments of understanding slowly, layer by layer, through stone that remembers an ocean long after the ocean itself disappeared. Science often appears solid from a distance, as though extinct animals emerge from stone already complete, their bodies neatly reconstructed beneath museum lights. Yet the closer paleontologists move toward Dunkleosteus, the more the edges soften into uncertainty. Beneath the confidence of mounted skulls and illustrated oceans lies an animal still partially hidden from view, separated from the present not only by time but by absence. No complete specimen has ever been found. Every reconstruction, whether compact and muscular or long and shark-shaped, begins from the same surviving anatomy. The armored head and thoracic plates preserved in shale, while the rest of the body disappeared into geological silence. Fins, musculature, tail shape, skin texture, and exact body depth remain inferred rather than observed directly. Paleontologists work outward from fragments, comparing living fish, studying biomechanics, and testing proportions against modern analogs. Yet much of the animal still exists within the space between evidence and interpretation. This uncertainty is most visible in the continuing debate over body size. One reconstruction tradition, dominant for much of the 20th century, imagined Dunkleosteus as an elongated open-water predator reaching lengths comparable to large modern sharks. More recent studies using orbit opercula measurements suggest a far shorter but denser animal, perhaps only 3 to 4 meters long, built with extraordinary mass concentrated into a compact frame. Both models remain present within scientific literature because each rests upon different assumptions regarding anatomy, scaling, and ecological function. The fossil record has not yet provided the missing body capable of settling the argument completely. The feeding mechanics debate has become equally unsettled. Earlier biomechanical studies produced dramatic bite force estimates based upon assumptions that Dunkleosteus employed suction feeding, rapidly expanding its mouth cavity to pull prey inward. Recent work by Russell Engelman and colleagues challenges that interpretation entirely, proposing instead that the animal functioned as a high-speed ram feeder using rigid jaws and blade-like shearing surfaces. If this newer model proves correct, decades of calculations concerning bite force, jaw speed, and prey capture mechanics may require extensive revision. Even the rhythm of the animal's life remains obscure. Paleontologists do not know its coloration. No fossil preserves pigment patterns capable of revealing whether the armor appeared dark, pale, mottled, reflective, or striped beneath Devonian sunlight. The social structure is equally uncertain. Some fossil associations hint that multiple individuals may have occupied similar environments simultaneously, perhaps even moving together under certain conditions, but the evidence remains too ambiguous to support firm conclusions. The ancient seabed preserves bodies more readily than behavior. Its physiology also remains unresolved. Some modern fast-swimming fish, including tuna and certain sharks, maintain body temperatures partially elevated above surrounding water through specialized circulatory systems known as regional endothermy. Whether arthrodires possessed any comparable adaptation is unknown. Dunkleosteus may have cruised through warm Devonian seas entirely dependent upon ambient temperatures, or it may have generated internal thermal advantages, allowing bursts of speed and muscular efficiency beyond what cold-blooded metabolism typically permits. Even the genus itself remains under debate. Between 8 and 10 species are currently recognized, scattered across Europe, North Africa, and North America, yet several are known only from incomplete remains. Future discoveries may consolidate species together, divide them further apart, or remove some entirely from the genus. And still, despite all of this uncertainty, certain things remain unmistakably real. The articulated armor plates preserved in shale, the self-sharpening jaw blades formed from bone instead of teeth, the cranial joint that lifted the skull into an enormous gape, the worldwide distribution across Devonian seas, the role as an apex predator in one of Earth's richest marine ecosystems, the survival through ecological collapse, followed finally by extinction at the end of the Devonian, when the long age of the placoderms disappeared completely into stone and memory, long before vertebrates walked across floodplains or lifted themselves into forests and deserts, before feathers, fur, or hands capable of shaping tools. The foundations of those bodies were already taking form beneath warm Devonian seas. Hidden inside armored fish, drifting through reef shadows and shallow inland oceans, were anatomical experiments that would outlast entire dynasties of life. Dunkleosteus belonged to one of those experiments, not as a biological dead end, but as part of the deeper architecture from which every later jawed vertebrate emerged. The connection feels distant only because time has stretched so enormously between the Devonian and the present world, yet the lineage itself remains continuous. Humans, sharks, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals all belong to the jawed vertebrates, a branch of life whose defining anatomical innovation first expanded explosively during the placoderm radiation. Somewhere within those ancient armored bodies, evolution assembled the earliest durable framework for biting, grasping, tearing, and processing food with articulated jaws, rather than simple suction or filter feeding. The jaw itself transformed vertebrate life permanently. Before its appearance, most vertebrates occupied relatively passive ecological roles, sifting particles from water or scavenging soft material from sediment. The emergence of articulated jaws opened entirely new possibilities. Predation intensified. Defense became more complex. Food could be manipulated, fractured, and consumed in ways earlier vertebrates could not achieve. Ecosystems changed because anatomy changed. Even now, traces of that transformation remain embedded deep within vertebrate developmental biology. During human embryonic growth, the genes responsible for shaping the jaw operate within ancient developmental pathways inherited across immense evolutionary time. The structures forming inside a developing human embryo follow homologous genetic instructions to those guiding jaw formation in early jawed fish. The outward forms differ completely, separated by hundreds of millions of years of modification, yet the underlying biological language still carries echoes of those Devonian origins. The same continuity extends into the limbs themselves. Placoderms were among the earliest vertebrates to possess paired pectoral and pelvic fins arranged along the body in stable anatomical patterns. Those fins were not merely swimming structures. Over evolutionary time, their descendants would become weight-bearing limbs capable of supporting bodies on land. Bones would lengthen, joints would diversify, musculature would reorganize, and digits would emerge. Yet the broad organizational blueprint began beneath ancient seas among fish whose descendants had not yet imagined shorelines. Reproductive biology followed a similar path. The fossil placoderms of the Gogo Formation revealed internal fertilization and live birth existing far earlier in vertebrate history than once believed. Embryos preserved inside armored mothers showed that complex reproductive systems had already evolved within Devonian oceans hundreds of millions of years before mammals appeared. The continuity between those early systems and modern vertebrate reproduction is not symbolic or metaphorical. It is anatomical ancestry carried forward through deep time. Dunkleosteus itself may not have survived the extinction that ended the Devonian, but many of the biological systems present within placoderms endured because other jawed vertebrates inherited and modified them. Jaws became beaks, snouts, muzzles, and human faces. Paired fins became wings, paws, hooves, and hands. Internal fertilization diversified into countless reproductive strategies across land and sea. Ancient developmental pathways persisted beneath changing outward forms. Seen from this perspective, the armored predator drifting through Devonian waters no longer appears entirely alien. Its skull joint, blade jaws, and heavy dermal plates belonged to a world profoundly different from the modern one. Yet, within that strange anatomy existed structures and genetic systems still active in living bodies today. The same evolutionary current that carried Dunkleosteus through tropical seas eventually produced vertebrates capable of studying fossils, reconstructing extinct worlds, and recognizing fragments of themselves inside stone shaped hundreds of millions of years before the first human breath. Beneath the modern Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, no trace of the Devonian seascape survives in living form. The waters still move across continental shelves, reefs still rise toward sunlight, and predators still cross open blue distances, yet the specific world that sustained Dunkleosteus has vanished completely. Its disappearance was not partial. Entire biological architectures were erased together until the oceans themselves reorganized into something fundamentally different. The stromatoporoid reefs that once stretched across tropical shelves no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Their layered calcium frameworks, built slowly by extinct sponge-like organisms over immense spans of time, disappeared during the ecological collapses of the late Devonian and never returned. The tabulate corals that grew beside them vanished as well. Even their closest ecological roles would later be filled by entirely unrelated organisms, separated not only by extinction but by evolutionary replacement. The armored, jawless fish that drifted and fed along Devonian seafloors disappeared with them. So did the placoderms, once the dominant vertebrate dynasty of the ocean. The intricate reef communities of Devonian ammonoids, trilobites, brachiopods, and countless lesser-known lineages fragmented and collapsed across millions of years until the structure of the ecosystem itself unraveled. The ocean did not simply lose species. It lost relationships, energy pathways, feeding systems, reproductive strategies, and ecological balances that had stabilized over tens of millions of years. What remained afterward were fragments, survivors occupying spaces around the edges of the old system. Among them were sharks, descendants of the relatively minor predators that had once lived beneath placoderm dominance. Their bodies, lighter and more flexible, endured conditions that the heavily armored giants could not survive. From those survivors came the lineage that still crosses modern oceans today. There is a strange continuity in that inheritance. Modern sharks move through seas entirely transformed from the Devonian world, yet they carry forward an ancient vertebrate strategy that endured while more dominant lineages disappeared. The apex predators of the modern ocean descend from animals that survived partly because they were not the rulers of their age. The center of the ecosystem collapsed first, while the margins persisted long enough to inherit what remained. And still, although the ecosystem itself vanished, fragments of it remain preserved in stone. Fossils resting in shale, limestone, and ancient marine sediments function almost like windows pressed into deep time, thin openings through which vanished oceans can still be partially observed. Armor plates retain scars from failed attacks. Jawbones preserve cutting edges shaped by vanished prey. Reef fossils preserve the geometry of extinct architectures no human eye ever witnessed alive. The same oxygen-depleted waters that contributed to Devonian ecological collapse also protected many of those remains from decay. Anoxic seabeds slowed decomposition, limiting bacterial destruction and scavenger activity long enough for burial to occur. The dying ocean became a recorder of its own disappearance. Recovery after the extinction unfolded slowly. The carboniferous seas that followed were biologically diminished for millions of years. Reef systems, once among the most expansive structures on Earth, remained sparse and reduced, while entirely new groups gradually evolved to occupy abandoned ecological space. Modern coral reefs eventually emerged much later, built by scleractinian corals that did not yet exist during the Devonian. Though they resemble ancient reefs outwardly, they are not descendants of the old systems. They are replacements, new architectures rising after total collapse. The ocean has rebuilt itself before. Across geological history, it has repeatedly dissolved, reorganized, and generated unfamiliar worlds from ecological ruin. The seas surrounding modern continents appear permanent only because human memory is short beside planetary time. Beneath that appearance lies a much older pattern, one in which oceans transform completely, dominant creatures disappear, and life slowly assembles new systems from the survivors left drifting after collapse. Across the immense history of Earth's oceans, extinction does not appear as a singular catastrophe, but as a recurring rhythm, slow and devastating, unfolding again and again beneath different skies and across different continents. Entire marine worlds rise into complexity, stabilize for millions of years, and then fracture under pressures that alter chemistry, climate, circulation, and life itself. The late Devonian collapse that ended the age of Dunkleosteus belongs to this much larger pattern, one chapter within a sequence of biological turnovers stretching across more than 500 million years. 5 times during that span, the marine biosphere has undergone restructuring so severe that the foundations of ocean life changed permanently afterward. Diversity crashed, dominant groups disappeared, reef systems collapsed, food webs reorganized themselves around survivors occupying spaces left empty by extinction. Each event carried its own causes and environmental triggers, yet the broad pattern remains strangely consistent. The apex predators, defining one age, rarely survive intact into the next. The Devonian seas lost the placoderms, and afterward, sharks expanded into ecological dominance. Yet this transition was only the first major exchange of power within the long history of marine predators. Hundreds of millions of years later, another extinction arrived, even more severe than the Devonian collapse. Near the end of the Permian period, approximately 252 million years ago, Earth experienced the event paleontologists now call the Great Dying. Ocean ecosystems suffered losses on a scale almost difficult to visualize. An estimated 96% of marine species disappeared as warming seas, widespread anoxia, acidification, and ecological collapse spread across the planet. Reef systems vanished almost completely. Entire evolutionary lineages ended together. And once again, after the collapse, survivors diversified into newly vacant ecological space. Marine reptiles rose during the Triassic and Jurassic oceans, evolving into forms unlike anything the Devonian seas had ever contained. Ichthyosaurs crossed open water with bodies converging upon the shape of dolphins millions of years before dolphins existed. Plesiosaurs drifted through marine ecosystems with long necks, powerful flippers, and hunting strategies adapted to the reorganized world left behind after extinction. Much later, another transition unfolded at the end of the Cretaceous. The extinction that eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs also transformed marine ecosystems, removing dominant reptilian predators that had ruled the seas for millions of years. Afterward, surviving vertebrate groups diversified once more. Mammalian lineages adapted increasingly to marine life, eventually giving rise to whales, seals, and other large ocean predators. Sharks endured again through this transition as well, reshaping themselves across changing ecological conditions while maintaining continuity with ancient ancestors that once swam beneath placoderm dominance. Seen across this broader scale, Dunkleosteus becomes part of a repeating sequence rather than an isolated marvel. Its rise, dominance, and disappearance follow patterns visible throughout marine history. Apex predators emerge within stable ecosystems, rich enough to support them. They refine specialized anatomies suited to the conditions of their age. Then, environmental disruption alters the balance sustaining those systems, and the dominant forms decline while more adaptable survivors inherit the aftermath. The ocean rarely preserves supremacy permanently. It reorganizes around change rather than loyalty to any single lineage. The predators appearing invincible within one geological period often vanish entirely when environmental conditions shift beyond the limits their specialized bodies can tolerate. What survives afterward is rarely the most imposing creature of the old world. More often, it is the flexible, generalized, or geographically widespread lineage occupying quieter ecological positions while dominant systems fail around them. Dunkleosteus ruled Devonian seas for millions of years with armor, blade jaws, and immense mechanical force. Yet even that dominance dissolved into stone when the structure of the ocean itself changed. Later, predators would rise from other lineages, shape other ecosystems, and disappear in turn. The deep history of marine life carries this rhythm repeatedly, a long procession of rulers emerging from survival, flourishing briefly beside geological time, and then passing into extinction while the ocean rebuilds itself once again. Long before humans began forging metal armor for warfare, evolution had already been experimenting with the same idea in flesh and bone. Across the history of life, armor emerged again and again as a solution to danger, a biological promise that survival could be secured through reinforcement, thickness, and resistance. shells thickened, skin hardened into plates, bones spread outward into shields and spikes. In stable environments rich with food and oxygen, these structures offered immense advantages. Predators were repelled. Impacts were absorbed. Bodies became fortresses capable of surviving encounters that would destroy softer organisms. Yet armor has always carried a hidden cost beneath its apparent strength. Dense protective structures demand energy to produce and maintain. Minerals must be gathered from the environment. Growth slows beneath the burden of reinforced anatomy. Mobility narrows into specialized pathways. A heavily armored creature does not merely wear protection, it organizes its entire biology around sustaining that protection through every stage of life. The Devonian placoderms embodied this strategy at a grand scale. Their cranial shields and thoracic plates transformed them into some of the most mechanically formidable vertebrates the ocean had yet produced. For millions of years, this investment succeeded spectacularly. In warm, shallow seas, dense with prey, armor allowed placoderms to dominate ecological space from the seafloor to the open water. Dunkleosteus carried this strategy toward one of its most extreme expressions, concentrating massive dermal bone around a hinged skull built for impact, force, and cutting power. But evolutionary success is measured only against the conditions existing at the time. When those conditions change rapidly, adaptations once advantageous can become anchors pulling a lineage downward. The fossil record preserves this pattern repeatedly. Trilobites ruled ancient oceans for more than 270 million years beneath segmented armored exoskeletons that defended them across vast spans of geological time. Yet they vanished entirely during the Permian extinction. Placoderms dominated Devonian seas through armor and jaw innovation, then disappeared completely at the end of their age. Much later, during the Pleistocene, glyptodonts wandered across ancient grasslands, carrying domed shells resembling living fortresses. Enormous armored mammals descended from relatives of modern armadillos. They too vanished while lighter, more adaptable forms endured around them. None of these extinctions occurred because armor suddenly failed during combat. The failure emerged from changing ecosystems. Environments shifted faster than rigid biological systems could respond. Food webs destabilized, climate altered, oxygen declined, habitats fragmented. The specialized conditions sustaining heavily armored organisms disappeared, and the organisms disappeared with them. By contrast, many of the lineages surviving repeated extinction events possessed bodies organized around flexibility rather than reinforcement. Sharks represent one of the clearest examples. Their skeletons are composed primarily of cartilage rather than dense bone, reducing energetic cost while preserving maneuverability and growth efficiency. Cartilage requires fewer mineral resources to maintain. Flexible skeletons allow rapid movement and broader ecological adaptability. Sharks could move between coastal and open water habitats, exploit different prey sources, and survive in environments where heavily armored vertebrates struggled to sustain themselves. This contrast becomes especially striking in the aftermath of the Devonian collapse. Placoderms, once the defining vertebrates of the ocean, vanished entirely. Sharks, still comparatively modest during the Devonian peak, endured and diversified into the ecological vacuum left behind. The qualities that once seemed secondary became survivable advantages in an unstable world. Across Earth's history, apex predators are rarely destroyed by direct rivals. More often, they are undone when the environment sustaining their dominance begins to disappear beneath them. Oceans cool or warm, oxygen falls. Coastlines retreat, reef systems collapse, prey communities vanish. The anatomy that once represented perfection for one world becomes increasingly mismatched to the next. In that sense, the armor of Dunkleosteus represents more than protection. It represents commitment, a biological wager that the surrounding world would remain recognizable long enough for such specialization to continue succeeding. For millions of years, that wager held. Then the ocean changed, and the weight of survival itself shifted toward creatures built not for permanence, but for adaptation. Beneath the roads, neighborhoods, factories, rivers, and sleeping towns of central North America lies the compressed memory of an ancient ocean. The landscapes that now seem solid and permanent were once submerged beneath warm equatorial water, moving slowly across broad continental shelves during the late Devonian. Long before highways crossed Ohio or cornfields spread across Indiana and Illinois, these regions existed beneath shallow tropical seas filled with armored fish, drifting ammonoids, reef organisms, and the immense predators that moved silently through suspended clouds of marine life. The geography of that world would be almost unrecognizable now. North America sat far closer to the equator, rotated into positions that no longer resemble the modern globe. What is now the American Midwest rested beneath a shallow inland sea, stretching across enormous distances, connected to ancient coastlines long erased by tectonic motion and erosion. Sunlight reached the seabed across much of this drowned continent, feeding dense reef systems built by stromatoporoids and tabulate corals, whose descendants no longer exist anywhere on Earth. The rocks beneath modern cities still preserve that vanished environment with extraordinary fidelity. Northern Ohio rests atop thick Devonian shale formations formed from fine sediment settling slowly through ancient seawater. Those sediments accumulated grain by grain across oxygen-poor seafloors where organic material decayed only partially before burial. Over hundreds of millions of years, pressure transformed that soft seabed mud into dark, lithified shale, lifting it gradually upward through geological change until it emerged into open air beside the waters of Lake Erie. The cliffs where J. Terrell discovered the first Dunkleosteus skull in the 19th century are not isolated wilderness exposures hidden in remote terrain. They stand near streets, neighborhoods, and ordinary urban infrastructure. The Devonian sea floor reaches the modern surface there, exposed quietly along the lake shore, where waves continue eroding rock that once rested beneath ancient tropical water. A person standing along those cliffs today occupies a boundary between two worlds, separated by nearly 360 million years of planetary history. Much of the limestone underlying the American Midwest also originates within that same vanished sea. These rocks were once living reef structures built slowly from the accumulated skeletons of marine organisms. Stromatoporoids layered calcium carbonate into massive reef frameworks, while tabulate corals expanded outward through warm, shallow water. Their bodies became architecture, and that architecture eventually became stone. Modern farmland, forests, suburbs, and industrial corridors now rest atop the compressed remains of extinct reef ecosystems that flourished before the first dinosaurs, before flowering plants, before vertebrate life had fully colonized land. Even the fossil fuels extracted across portions of Western Canada and the central United States remain tied to the biology of that Devonian ocean. Organic matter from algae, microorganisms, and marine ecosystems settled into ancient sediments, buried beneath pressure and heat for immense spans of time. The resulting hydrocarbons became oil and gas reservoirs that modern civilization now drills, transports, refines, and burns. In a very literal sense, fragments of the Devonian Sea continue moving through pipelines, engines, furnaces, and electrical grids across the modern world. This connection between present landscapes and ancient oceans changes the scale of deep time into something physical and immediate. The world of Dunkleosteus is not sealed away inside museums or distant textbooks. Its remains form part of the geological foundation beneath homes, bridges, railways, and sleeping cities across North America. Ancient reefs became limestone bedrock. Seafloor mud became shale cliffs. Marine biomass became fuel stored deep underground. The ocean that carried armored predators across equatorial waters did not disappear without trace. It hardened into the continents themselves. Beneath ordinary modern life, beneath concrete and soil and steel, the Devonian still exists as buried architecture from a world that once covered the center of a continent with warm water and moving shadows. There is a point where numbers stop behaving like experience and begin behaving like landscape. Deep time exists beyond ordinary intuition, beyond the rhythms human memory was shaped to understand. A lifetime can be imagined. A century can be pictured through photographs and architecture. Even a few thousand years can still feel connected to recognizable human stories. But hundreds of millions of years stretch so far beyond direct comprehension that the mind begins to lose all stable sense of proportion. Dunkleosteus belonged to a world separated from the present by approximately 360 million years. Modern humans, by contrast, have existed as a species for roughly 300,000 years. Written language reaches back only about 5,000 years, a span so brief beside Devonian time that it nearly disappears mathematically. Every kingdom, empire, migration, invention, religion, and city in recorded history occupies only the thinnest fraction of the interval separating the modern world from the ancient ocean where placoderms once moved through equatorial seas. The scale becomes stranger the longer it is considered. When Dunkleosteus vanished during the end Devonian extinction, the Atlantic Ocean did not yet exist. The continents were still drifting gradually toward the assembly of Pangaea, the immense supercontinent that itself would not fully form for tens of millions of years after placoderms disappeared. Later still, Pangaea would fragment apart once again, opening oceans and reshaping coastlines over spans of time longer than the entire existence of mammals. The familiar geography of the modern Earth had not yet emerged. The Rocky Mountains did not exist. The Himalayas did not exist. The Alps did not exist. Many of the mountain systems that now dominate continents would rise only after immense cycles of tectonic collision and uplift occurring long after the Devonian seas had vanished. Even the outlines of the continents themselves were profoundly different, their positions shifting slowly across the planet through motions measured not in years, but in geological epochs. The dinosaurs, so often imagined as inhabitants of unimaginably ancient worlds, still belonged to a future impossibly distant from Dunkleosteus. More than 130 million years would pass between the extinction of the great placoderms and the appearance of the earliest dinosaurs. Entire evolutionary worlds rose and vanished within that interval alone. Human cognition struggles with these scales because the brain evolved for immediate survival, social memory, seasonal movement, and short generational time. We understand duration through repetition and lived experience. A human life provides only a narrow window through which to measure existence. Deep time exceeds that window so completely that it becomes almost abstract, like trying to imagine the full size of an ocean while standing inside a single wave. This is partly why fossils carry such strange emotional weight. They compress impossible spans into physical objects small enough to stand beside. A skull preserved in stone allows the mind to anchor itself against durations otherwise too large to picture clearly. Calcium, once incorporated into living tissue, survives through mineral replacement and burial, carried across geological ages until modern eyes encounter it beneath museum lights or exposed cliff faces. The fossils of Dunkleosteus are not merely evidence of an extinct animal. They are fragments of a vanished Earth carried intact across nearly incomprehensible stretches of planetary history. Between that living predator and the present day, continents assembled and broke apart, oceans opened and closed, reefs rose and disappeared, mountains formed from seabeds, and entire evolutionary dynasties emerged before vanishing in turn. Yet the stone remains. A person can stand quietly before the armored skull in a museum hall and occupy the same physical space as matter that once moved through a Devonian sea long before forests covered most continents, long before vertebrates fully conquered land, long before any creature resembling a human had appeared. Deep time becomes tangible only in these moments, where the immense history of Earth condenses briefly into something solid enough to touch with the imagination. In museums and documentaries, extinction is often framed as disappearance, a final collapse into silence. Species vanish from the fossil record and are spoken of as if they somehow failed the test of survival. Yet the deeper history of life suggests something far more complex. Extinction is not necessarily evidence of weakness, nor is survival always evidence of superiority. Entire dynasties can dominate the Earth for spans of time so immense that human civilization appears microscopic beside them, only to vanish when the planet itself changes direction. Dunkleosteus existed as one of the apex predators of the Devonian Ocean for approximately 25 million years. That duration alone exceeds comprehension when compared to human history. The entirety of recorded civilization occupies only a tiny fraction of that span. Languages rose and vanished, empires formed and dissolved, and continents themselves shifted position in less time than placoderms ruled the seas. Even the great white shark, so often treated as the definitive marine predator of the modern world, has existed in something close to its present form for only a few million years. By comparison, the reign of Dunkleosteus stretched across intervals of geological time long enough for entire ecosystems to evolve around its presence. It hunted through generations of oceans that rose and receded over continental shelves while reefs expanded across tropical seas. Nothing within that environment appears to have surpassed it directly. No rival predator replaced it through competition. No evidence suggests some newly evolved hunter simply outperformed the placoderms in combat. The forces that ended their dominance operated at scales larger than predation itself. Forests spread across the continents, root systems altered weathering rates, nutrients flooded rivers and coastal seas, oxygen collapsed within marine ecosystems. Climate shifted, reef systems failed, food webs fragmented. The physical structure of the world, sustaining Devonian oceans, changed beneath the organisms adapted to them. In this sense, extinction resembles ecological transition more than defeat. The rise of one lineage alters conditions for countless others, often in ways no organism can anticipate or resist. The first forests transformed the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans while succeeding spectacularly on land. Their expansion opened entirely new evolutionary pathways for terrestrial ecosystems, yet simultaneously destabilized shallow marine environments that had persisted for millions of years. Life continuously reshapes the conditions of life around it. This pattern repeats throughout Earth's history. Cyanobacteria released oxygen into an atmosphere that once lacked it, transforming the planet while driving many anaerobic organisms toward extinction. Land plants altered climate and weathering systems. Mammals diversified partly because non-avian dinosaurs disappeared after the end Cretaceous extinction. Every living ecosystem exists, partly because older systems collapsed and created ecological space for something new to emerge. Seen from this perspective, extinction becomes less like failure and more like succession within an ongoing planetary process. No ecological arrangement remains permanent. Dominant organisms eventually encounter environments different from the ones that originally shaped their success. Some lineages persist by remaining flexible and broadly adaptable. Others become exquisitely specialized for worlds that later vanish. The Devonian placoderms belong to one such world. Their armor, jaws, reproductive systems, and predatory strategies were astonishingly successful within the warm, shallow seas that supported them. For tens of millions of years, they occupied ecological positions few vertebrates before them had ever reached. The fact that their story eventually ended does not diminish the scale of that achievement. Every species alive now occupies temporary ecological ground inherited from organisms that came before. Forests replaced earlier landscapes. Mammals expanded into spaces once dominated by reptiles. Modern reefs stand where older reef systems vanished entirely. Sharks inherited oceans once ruled by armored fish. Extinction, then, is not merely disappearance. It is the mechanism through which the history of life continues moving forward, clearing space, redistributing opportunity, and reshaping the structure of the living world across spans of time far larger than any single species can perceive while it exists, far beneath the modern surface of the Atlantic and Pacific, beyond shipping lanes and satellite networks and illuminated coastlines. The chemistry of the ocean is changing in ways that echo patterns buried deep within the geological record. The resemblance is not exact, nor should it be simplified into direct repetition. The Devonian extinction unfolded across spans of time so immense that entire mountain systems rose and eroded during its progression. Yet certain underlying processes unfolding in the modern ocean carry an uneasy familiarity when viewed beside the ancient collapse that ended the age of placoderms. During the late Devonian, one of the defining drivers of ecological instability was anoxia, the depletion of dissolved oxygen within marine environments. In oxygen-poor water, complex marine organisms struggle to survive. Food webs destabilize, reef systems weaken, entire regions of the sea become biological dead zones where only specialized organisms can persist. Geological evidence suggests these conditions spread repeatedly through Devonian oceans during the Kellwasser and Hangenberg crises, disrupting ecosystems that had once appeared stable across millions of years. Modern oceans now contain expanding regions of hypoxia as well. Along coastlines and continental shelves, nutrient runoff from agriculture and industrial activity stimulates immense algal blooms. When the algae die, decomposition consumes oxygen from the surrounding water, producing marine dead zones where fish and invertebrate populations collapse or flee. More than 400 such regions have now been documented globally, a number with no known equivalent in pre-industrial history. The mechanism itself is strikingly familiar. During the Devonian, the spread of deep-rooted forests increased nutrient transport into rivers and shallow seas, feeding blooms that altered oxygen balance across marine ecosystems. Today, fertilizers and industrial runoff accelerate a similar process through human activity. Different causes exist at the surface level, but the ocean responds according to the same underlying chemistry. Reef systems provide another parallel written across distant eras. The Devonian reefs built by stromatoporoids and tabulate corals once formed some of the largest reef complexes the Earth had ever seen. They supported dense marine biodiversity across tropical seas for tens of millions of years before environmental disruption triggered widespread collapse. Those reef systems vanished so completely that their builders left no living descendants. Modern coral reefs are biologically unrelated to Devonian reefs, yet they now occupy comparable ecological roles within the oceans of the present world. Though coral reefs cover less than 1% of the seafloor, they support approximately 1/4 of all marine species through intricate webs of shelter, feeding, breeding, and nutrient cycling. Rising temperatures, acidification, pollution, and oxygen disruption are now driving mass bleaching events across reef systems worldwide, weakening ecosystems that many marine organisms depend upon for survival. The comparison does not imply that the modern ocean is simply repeating Devonian history. The scales differ enormously. Devonian environmental changes unfolded over millions of years through gradual planetary processes. Modern changes are occurring across decades and centuries, intervals so brief in geological terms that they resemble sudden shocks. Yet the fossil record offers a persistent reminder that marine ecosystems, no matter how ancient or stable they appear, are not permanent structures immune to collapse. Oceans reorganize when chemistry, climate, and nutrient systems cross certain thresholds. Apex predators, especially large specialized forms, often struggle to adapt quickly once the ecosystems supporting them begin to fragment beneath them. Dunkleosteus existed within oceans that once seemed enduring beyond measure. Reef systems stretched across continents. Placoderms dominated ecological networks for tens of millions of years. Warm, shallow seas supported immense biodiversity through ages of apparent stability. Then the structure holding that world together began changing gradually, then irreversibly. The Devonian record does not function as prophecy, nor as simple warning. It functions as perspective. It reveals that oceans possess histories far older and more dynamic than human civilization, and that biological dominance, even across immense spans of time, remains dependent upon environmental conditions that can shift beneath entire ecosystems with surprising finality once certain processes begin unfolding at planetary scale. In a museum hall beside the shore of Lake Erie, suspended beneath controlled lighting and surrounded by the soft echo of footsteps on polished floors, there hangs the reconstructed skull of an animal older than forests filled with birds, older than flowering plants, older than the Atlantic Ocean itself. Visitors pass beneath it carrying phones, winter jackets, coffee cups, fragments of ordinary afternoons. Some pause for a moment beneath the armored jaws. Some continue walking, yet the fossil above them carries a weight of time so immense that language struggles to contain it. Somewhere within the shale cliffs of northern Ohio, more fragments almost certainly remain buried. Armor plates still sealed within black sediment, broken jaw elements pressed into ancient mud, pieces of an animal that once moved through a tropical inland sea beneath a hotter Devonian sky, long before grasslands or mammals or human cities existed anywhere on Earth. The waters it inhabited no longer exist. The reefs that sustained its world vanished hundreds of millions of years ago. Even the arrangement of the continents has been erased and rewritten repeatedly since its extinction. Yet the bone remains. The skull, preserved in the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, is more than the remnant of a single predator. It is evidence of one of the earliest, fully developed, complex marine ecosystems that vertebrate life ever produced. Its armor records biological engineering already astonishingly sophisticated more than 360 million years ago. Its jaw mechanism reveals predatory specialization, emerging at a scale the world had never previously seen. The fossil carries proof that oceans of immense complexity existed long before humanity arrived to witness them. From those bones, certain truths can still be reconstructed with confidence. We know the structure of the cranial shield and the hinge that connected skull plates together. We know the sharpened jaw blades could slice through flesh and bone with extraordinary force. We know placoderms spread across Devonian seas for tens of millions of years and occupied ecological roles ranging from bottom-feeding grazers to apex predators. We know Dunkleosteus stood at the top of one of those systems for an immense span of geological time before extinction erased its lineage completely. Other things remain permanently inaccessible. No fossil can preserve sensation, awareness, or experience. Bone cannot record the texture of movement through warm Devonian water. It cannot preserve instinct, perception, or whatever internal state accompanied the existence of a creature with no natural predator beyond members of its own species. The fossil record offers anatomy, traces, chemistry, and structure. Beyond that boundary lies silence. Still, the silence itself carries meaning. The skull reminds us that the oceans have always contained forms stranger than modern imagination tends to assume. Apex predators rise repeatedly across Earth's history, hold dominance for spans of time so vast they appear permanent, then disappear as environmental systems reorganize around them. Nothing in the marine world keeps its position forever. The sharks that now dominate the ocean inherited ecological space only after the placoderms vanished. The reefs alive today are not descendants of Devonian reef builders, but replacements that emerged after total collapse reshaped marine ecosystems from their foundations. Every surviving lineage carries within it the absence of something older that no longer exists. Far into the future, long after modern coastlines have shifted and present ecosystems transformed again, other oceans will exist under unfamiliar skies. New predators will emerge from lineages not yet dominant. New reef systems may rise where present seas have disappeared. The processes shaping those distant worlds are already unfolding now, just as the first forests once altered the chemistry of Devonian oceans long before any placoderm could adapt to the consequences. And beneath ordinary ground, beneath highways and cities and quiet neighborhoods near the shores of Lake Erie, the rock continues holding its record patiently. Armor plates sleep inside shale. Ancient seabeds rest beneath modern soil. The water moved on, the ecosystems changed, the predators vanished, yet the evidence endured, waiting in darkness for another set of human hands to uncover what deep time chose to leave behind.